The blizzard had been falling for 6 days straight, and the main cabin door was buried under 9 feet of snow. Inside the hidden room carved into the hillside, Thomas Garrett sat by his small fire, warm and well-fed, while 3 miles away, another trapper froze to death in his collapsed shelter. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale might just save your life in ways you never imagined. The winter of 1842 arrived in the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory with a cold that settled into the valleys and refused to leave. Thomas Garrett had survived 8 seasons in these mountains, trapping beaver and marten along the tributaries that fed into the upper Green River. He was 31 years old, capable with rifle and axe, and deliberate in ways that kept men breathing in country where carelessness meant death. His cabin sat in a protected valley with good water access and abundant beaver activity. The structure followed standard mountain construction: notched logs, mud chinking, stone fireplace, single door, 1 small window. It had served him through 7 winters without major problems. Marcus Webb worked similar territory 20 miles upstream. The 2 men maintained the loose association common among trappers operating overlapping ranges. They would meet every few weeks to share information about beaver populations, discuss trapped-out areas, and warn each other about grizzly activity or hostile tribal movements through the region. The relationship was practical rather than personal, built on mutual survival interests. The blizzard started January 23rd. Thomas had been checking trap lines that morning when wind shifted from the southwest and brought clouds that looked wrong. Mountain experience taught him to read weather, and what approached made him abandon his work immediately. He returned to his cabin, secured the door, brought extra firewood inside from his outdoor stack, and prepared to wait out what he assumed would be a typical 2- or 3-day storm. Snow fell continuously for 5 days. Thomas burned through his indoor wood supply and ventured outside twice to retrieve more from his covered stack, fighting through drifts reaching his waist. Wind drove snow horizontally, reducing visibility to arm's length. Temperature dropped to levels that froze exposed skin in minutes. He kept his fire burning constantly, feeding it without pause, watching his carefully accumulated winter wood supply disappear at alarming rates. By the 5th day, when the storm finally cleared, he had consumed nearly all the fuel he had cut for the entire month. When conditions allowed travel, Thomas strapped on snowshoes and fought upstream toward Marcus's location. The landscape had transformed completely. Drifts stood 8 to 10 feet tall, where wind channeled between ridges, trees bent under snow weight. The silence, after 5 days of constant wind, felt oppressive. He found Marcus's cabin with its roof collapsed. The accumulated snow weight had exceeded what the structure could support, probably on the 3rd or 4th day. Thomas dug through wreckage and found Marcus inside, frozen, still wrapped in blankets. He had likely survived the initial collapse, but could not maintain heat without his fireplace. The temperature inside a roofless cabin during a blizzard matched outside temperature exactly. Marcus had frozen to death over perhaps 24 hours. Thomas buried what he could under hillside rocks. The frozen ground prevented proper burial. He spent that night in his own cabin, staring at his fireplace, thinking about structural failure. Marcus had been competent. His cabin had been built adequately by frontier standards. But adequate had not been sufficient. When the roof failed, there had been no backup option. Marcus had simply died. Something changed in Thomas that night. Most men accepted this as mountain life's inevitable cost. Thomas could not. Thomas spent the next 3 weeks finishing his trapping season, but his mind was not on beaver pelts. He kept returning to the same questions. What killed Marcus was not the storm itself, but the single point of failure: 1 roof, 1 door, 1 heat source. When any critical element failed, the entire survival system collapsed. Every mountain cabin he had ever seen followed the same design pattern, because that pattern was all anyone knew. Build 4 walls, add a roof, install a door, construct a fireplace. The method was universal because it was traditional, not because it was optimal. He began visiting other trappers' camps as he worked his way down from the high country toward Spring Rendezvous. At each location, he examined cabin construction with new attention to detail. He found a structure where a grizzly had torn through the door while the occupant was away. He saw a cabin where heavy snow had collapsed one wall, making the interior uninhabitable. He discovered an abandoned site where the fireplace had caught the roof on fire, destroying everything. Each failure demonstrated the same fundamental vulnerability. Mountain cabins were barely adequate shelters that provided minimal protection and offered no backup options when primary systems failed. Thomas talked to survivors. A trapper named William Morrison described spending 4 days trapped in his cabin when an avalanche buried his door under 12 feet of snow. He had survived only because he managed to dig a tunnel through his window opening, working for hours with a frying pan as his only tool. Another man, Robert Chen, told of a January night when his fireplace chimney became blocked with ice, filling his cabin with smoke. He had nearly suffocated before smashing through his window to create ventilation, then spent the rest of the night freezing because he could not risk using his fireplace. The pattern was consistent. Men survived mountain winters through luck and desperation, not through sound engineering. When something went wrong with their single-room, single-system cabins, they improvised frantically or died. There was no margin for error, no redundancy, no planned backup. Thomas found this unacceptable. He had watched Marcus freeze because a roof failed. He himself had nearly burned through all his fuel during that same storm. If the blizzard had lasted 7 days instead of 5, he might have frozen as well. Other trappers accepted these risks with fatalistic pragmatism. They built their cabins in 4 or 5 days, using methods passed down from previous generations of frontiersmen. They survived or they did not. That was mountain life. Thomas could not adopt this mindset. Marcus's death had made the danger concrete and immediate in a way that abstract awareness never had. He became obsessed with a single question that consumed his thoughts during long days on the trap lines and longer nights alone in his cabin. How do you build a shelter system that does not fail completely when one component breaks? The question had no obvious answer, but Thomas was determined to find one. Spring of 1843 brought Thomas down from the mountains with his season's furs and a mind full of architectural problems. Most trappers arriving at the trading posts in South Pass or Fort Bridger would sell their pelts, spend 2 weeks drinking and gambling, then head back to the wilderness with basic supplies. Thomas sold his beaver and marten skins for a respectable profit, then spent the next month traveling to settlements and studying buildings with the intensity of a man whose life depended on understanding construction principles. He rode south to Fort Laramie, then east to a small settlement on the North Platte, where a handful of farmers and merchants had established permanent structures. He watched carpenters working on a new warehouse, paying particular attention to how they reinforced door frames and created storage spaces. He examined root cellars dug into hillsides, noting how the earth maintained cool temperatures even during summer heat. He talked to a German stonemason named Klaus, who was building a foundation for a trading post, and listened carefully when the man explained how stone and earth worked together to create stable structures. The stonemason told him something that changed how Thomas thought about shelter. Earth maintains constant temperature year-round at depth. In summer, when surface temperature reaches 90 degrees, soil 6 feet down stays around 50 degrees. In winter, when surface temperature drops to 0 or below, that same soil remains near 50 degrees. The earth acts as a thermal mass, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it slowly, resisting rapid temperature changes. Root cellars stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter because they were surrounded by this stable thermal mass. Thomas asked questions that made the stonemason laugh. "Could you build a room into a hillside and heat it?" "Of course," Klaus said, "but why would you?" "To survive when your main cabin fails," Thomas answered. The stonemason stopped laughing and looked at him with new interest. "You are serious about this?" Klaus said. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Then you must understand ventilation," the German told him. "Fire needs air. Smoke must escape. Build a room into earth, and you must engineer how air moves, or you will suffocate or die from smoke. The two men spent an afternoon discussing chimney design, draft principles, and flue construction. Thomas visited a mining operation where men were digging exploratory tunnels into a hillside, searching for silver deposits. He studied how they shored up earthen walls with timber framing to prevent collapse. He observed their ventilation shafts and learned how they calculated the amount of air needed to keep lanterns burning and men breathing in enclosed underground spaces. The mine foreman thought he was looking for work and offered him a job. Thomas declined but asked if he could watch them work for a few days. The foreman shrugged and agreed. By late June, Thomas had filled a small journal with sketches and notes. He had spent money on knowledge rather than whiskey. Other trappers thought he was strange. Thomas did not care. He had learned enough to attempt something no mountain man had tried before. He purchased unusual supplies, loaded his pack animals, and headed back into the Wind River Range with specific plans and summer construction work ahead. Thomas returned to the mountains in early July, with supplies that confirmed what other trappers already suspected. He had lost his mind. His pack animals carried the standard items, powder and lead, and coffee and salt, but also 60 pounds of iron hardware, specialized digging tools called mattocks and spades, extra canvas, rope, and wooden pegs by the hundreds. A trapper named Harrison saw his outfit at the last trading post and asked what he planned to build. A better cabin, Thomas answered. Harrison laughed and said any cabin built in 4 days was good enough for mountain winters. Thomas did not argue. He selected his location with obsessive care. Most trappers built near water for convenience. Thomas chose a site on elevated ground with a gradual hillside rising behind it. The slope faced south, which meant maximum sun exposure during winter months. The hillside itself was crucial. He needed earth he could excavate without causing collapse, soil composition that would be stable, and enough rise to create a chamber that could be entered from his cabin's interior. He spent 3 days examining different locations before settling on a spot where the soil showed layers of clay and gravel, good drainage, and solid structure. He built his main cabin first, but not in the standard 4 days. He took 2 weeks, working alone, constructing a solid single-room structure 16 feet by 14 feet. The cabin appeared conventional from outside, notched logs and a stone fireplace, but Thomas positioned everything with specific intent. The back wall sat only 4 feet from the hillside. The door faced east. The window was on the south wall. The fireplace occupied the northeast corner. Other trappers passing through saw nothing unusual. Thomas knew the back wall was precisely placed to allow what came next. In early August, he began excavating. He worked from behind his cabin, digging into the hillside at an angle that would bring him under and slightly beyond his back wall. The work was brutal. He removed earth 1 shovelful at a time, carrying it away in a canvas sling to avoid creating an obvious pile near his cabin. He dug carefully, testing the soil, watching for water seepage or unstable layers. The chamber took shape slowly, 8 feet deep into the hillside, 7 feet wide, 6 feet in ceiling height. Every dimension calculated for a specific purpose. As he hollowed out the space, he installed support structures using techniques he had learned at the mining operation. He cut logs to length and positioned them as vertical supports against the earthen walls. He added horizontal bracing. He used flat stones to create a stable floor base before laying wooden planks. The ceiling required particular attention. He installed heavy beams, then covered them with split planks, then layers of bark, then clay mixed with grass, then finally 6 inches of soil. The weight was substantial, but the support structure distributed it safely. Above ground, the disturbed soil looked like a natural part of the hillside. By mid-September, after 6 weeks of solitary labor, Thomas had created an empty room carved into the earth behind his cabin. The hard part was finished. Now came the precise work that would make it functional. The doorway required destroying part of what Thomas had already built. He stood inside his completed cabin, marking the back wall where he would cut through. The opening needed to Be large enough to move supplies through, but small enough to seal effectively against heat loss. He settled on dimensions of 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. The cut would remove sections of 3 logs. Most builders would consider this structural suicide. Thomas had planned for it. Before cutting, he installed a header beam above where the opening would be. He notched the logs on either side of his planned doorway and set a thick pine beam across the gap, securing it with iron brackets and wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The header would carry the weight of all logs above the opening, preventing collapse. He tested it by hanging his full body weight from the beam. It held without flexing. He cut through the logs using a saw and axe, working from inside the cabin. Each cut was precise, creating clean edges. Wood chips and sawdust accumulated on his floor. After 2 days of careful work, he broke through into the earthen chamber behind his cabin. Light from his cabin, windows spilled into the hidden room for the first time. The opening was perfect, 3 feet wide, 5 feet tall, edges square and clean. He built the door itself from pine planks 2 inches thick. The boards ran horizontally, each one spanning the full 3-foot width of the opening. He fitted 8 planks together to create the 5-foot height. Using tongue and groove joints, he cut by hand with a chisel and mallet. On the back side, facing into the hidden room, he attached 3 heavy cross braces running vertically. These braces held the horizontal planks together and provided mounting points for the hinges. The hinges were substantial iron hardware, each one weighing 3 pounds. He had purchased them at Fort Laramie specifically for this door. He mortised them into the left edge of the doorframe and into the corresponding cross brace on the door itself. The mortises were deep rectangular pockets that the hinge plates sat inside, flush with the wood surface. He secured each hinge with bolts that passed completely through both the doorframe log and the door cross brace, clinching them on the far side. To remove these hinges, someone would need to destroy the wood itself. The door swung smoothly on its hinges, opening into the main cabin. When closed, it sat flush against the interior wall. Thomas had cut the planks so their width and grain pattern matched the cabin's other interior finishing. The seam where door met frame was tight enough that he had to pack it with thin strips of cloth around all 4 edges to create a proper seal. He installed a simple wooden latch on the main cabin side, a bar that dropped into iron brackets. From inside the hidden room, the door had no handle, no latch, nothing. It could only be opened from the cabin side. Thomas tested it repeatedly, opening and closing, checking the seal, examining the hinges. After 3 days of adjustment, the door worked perfectly. When closed, it was nearly invisible. The hidden room needed heat, which meant Thomas needed to solve a problem that most frontier builders never considered. How do you build a second fireplace in a structure that already has 1 chimney without revealing the second fire's existence from outside? A new chimney emerging from the hillside would announce the hidden room's location to anyone passing nearby. Thomas needed the smoke from his secondary hearth to exit through his existing chimney system invisibly. He began inside the hidden room, selecting the location for his hearth carefully. The northwest corner placed it closest to the main cabin's fireplace, which occupied the northeast corner on the other side of the wall. The proximity was intentional. He would connect the 2 systems internally, making them appear as a single chimney from outside. Thomas built a small firebox using flat stones he had collected from a nearby creek. The firebox was only 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, much smaller than a standard fireplace. He did not need large fires in this compact space. He needed controlled, efficient heat that would warm 300 cubic feet of air, not 2,000. He laid the stones without mortar initially, testing the fit, adjusting until each stone sat solidly against its neighbors. Then he mixed clay with water and sand to create a paste that would bind the stones and seal gaps. The back wall of the firebox angled upward at 45 degrees, creating a smoke shelf that would reflect heat forward into the room and prevent downdrafts. Above the smoke shelf, he built a narrow flue using more flat stones, creating a vertical channel 8 inches square. This flue climbed the interior wall of the hidden room, heading upward toward where it would meet the main cabin's chimney system. The critical junction happened inside the wall space between the hidden room and main cabin. Thomas had deliberately built his cabin's back wall with enough thickness to accommodate what he planned. He carefully removed chinking between logs and excavated a channel that allowed his secondary flue to connect into the main chimney approximately 4 feet above the main fireplace opening. The connection was a stone sleeve that merged the two flues into a single channel. Smoke from either fire would rise through the combined system and exit at the single chimney top. He tested the draft by burning small amounts of dried grass in his secondary hearth while the main fireplace was cold. Smoke rose properly, drawing up through his new flue, merging with the main chimney, and exiting above the roof. He climbed outside and watched. One chimney, one smoke plume, no indication that two separate fires were burning inside. He tested again with the main fireplace burning and the secondary hearth burning simultaneously. Both drew properly, neither interfered with the other's draft. The engineering was sound, but Thomas spent another week sealing every gap with his clay mixture, ensuring no smoke could leak into living spaces. He added a small iron grate in the secondary firebox to hold fuel efficiently. When finished, he had a heating system that could warm his hidden room using minimal wood while remaining completely invisible from outside. Other mountain men had one fireplace, Thomas had two, and nobody would know. With the heating system functional, Thomas turned his attention to making the hidden room livable and provisioned for extended occupation. The earthen floor, even with its stone base, would eventually transfer cold and moisture into the space. He needed a proper wooden floor that would create an insulating air gap between ground and living surface. He spent 4 days splitting logs into planks using wedges and a maul, then smoothing them with a draw knife until they were uniform thickness. He fitted the planks tightly together across the entire floor surface, creating a solid platform elevated 3 inches above the stone base on wooden sleepers. The result was a floor that felt solid underfoot and would keep stored goods dry. The walls required shelving, but not furniture that could be moved or knocked over. Thomas wanted integrated storage that maximized every inch of limited space. He mounted horizontal support beams directly into the log framing that lined the earthen walls, spacing them at different heights to create 3 distinct shelf levels. The top shelf ran along the back and side walls at head height, approximately 6 feet up. The middle shelf sat at chest level, 4 feet high. The lower shelf was positioned 2 feet above the floor. Each shelf was deep enough to hold substantial supplies, but shallow enough that items remained accessible. He cut shelf boards from pine, shaping them to fit the irregular contours where earthen walls met wooden framing. Every board was secured with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes into the support beams. The shelving was permanent architecture, not removable furniture. Once installed, it became part of the room's structure, capable of supporting significant weight without shifting or collapsing. Thomas began stocking his shelves in late September as his fall hunting provided supplies. The top shelf received wooden containers he had carved and sealed with pine pitch. These held rendered bear fat for cooking and lamp fuel, dried berries collected from mountain slopes, ground cornmeal purchased at the trading post, salt packed in bark boxes, and medicinal herbs, including willow bark, for pain and yarrow for wounds. The containers were uniform in size, stackable, and sealed against moisture and rodents. The middle shelf held folded wool blankets, extra clothing, and cured meat. Thomas had spent weeks smoking and drying elk and venison into strips that would remain edible for months. He hung these from wooden pegs mounted below the shelf, creating curtains of preserved meat that represented weeks of protein. Additional containers on this shelf held dried fish, pemmican he had made from berries and rendered fat, and hard biscuits that would survive indefinitely in the dry environment. The lower shelf stored tools, ammunition, candles, fire-starting materials, rope, and a spare knife. Thomas positioned a water barrel near the door where he could refill it from the main cabin. Next to the secondary hearth, he stacked split firewood in a neat pile, each piece cut to uniform length for efficient burning. By early October, the hidden room contained everything needed to sustain one man for 6 weeks without leaving. Thomas stepped back and examined what he had created. The room was small, organized, and completely self-sufficient. It was ready for winter. The first significant snowfall of winter 1843 arrived in early November, earlier than Thomas had expected. He woke before dawn to silence that experienced mountain men recognized immediately. Snow was falling heavily. By the time full daylight arrived, 4 inches had accumulated, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Thomas went about his normal routine, maintaining his main cabin's fire, eating breakfast, checking his supplies. But part of his mind was already considering the test he had been anticipating since finishing construction. By midday, 8 inches covered the ground. By evening, the accumulation reached 16 inches and continued falling. The temperature dropped steadily. Thomas made his decision. He would spend the next 3 days living entirely in his hidden room, simulating the conditions he might face if his main cabin became unusable during a severe storm. He gathered his immediate necessities, opened the concealed door, and stepped into the earthen chamber. He closed and latched the door behind him, sealing himself into the hidden room. The space felt small after the main cabin's larger dimensions, but not uncomfortably so. He lit 1 candle for initial light, then built a small fire in the secondary hearth using kindling and 3 split logs. He had calculated that 3 logs should burn for approximately 4 hours based on their size and the efficient firebox design. The fire caught easily, drawing properly through the flue system. Thomas sat on a folded blanket and watched the flames. Within 30 minutes, he noticed the room's temperature rising. Within an hour, the space felt genuinely warm. He added 1 more log and let the fire settle into steady burning. The compact dimensions meant the small fire heated the entire volume efficiently. In his main cabin, he would have needed a fire 3 times this size to achieve similar warmth. As the first day progressed, Thomas discovered how the room's design elements worked together. The earth walls radiated a constant moderate temperature, absorbing heat from the fire and releasing it slowly. Even when the fire burned down to coals, the room remained comfortable. The stored supplies, jars and containers, and stacked wood absorbed warmth and created thermal mass that stabilized temperature fluctuations. The wooden floor prevented cold from seeping up through the ground. He used remarkably little firewood. 3 logs every 4 hours meant 18 logs per day. His main cabin required 60 to 70 logs daily during cold weather to maintain livable temperature. The hidden room used less than 1/3 the fuel while providing equal or better warmth. Thomas had expected efficiency, but the actual performance exceeded his calculations. On the 3rd day, he emerged from the hidden room and checked his main cabin. The fire had died completely. The interior temperature matched the outside air, well below freezing. Snow had drifted against the door. If this had been a real emergency where his main cabin was damaged or inaccessible, the hidden room would have kept him alive comfortably while using only the wood supply he had stored inside. Thomas stood in his cold main cabin and smiled. The system worked. The impossible thing he had built actually functioned, exactly as intended. Winter could come. He was ready. February of 1844 brought weather that made the previous winter's deadly storm seem mild by comparison. A massive system moved down from the Arctic and stalled over the Wind River Range, trapped between mountain ridges that prevented its eastward progression. Snow began falling on February 9th and continued with barely any pause for 8 consecutive days. Thomas had experienced mountain blizzards before, but nothing approached this storm's duration and intensity. The first 2 days were manageable. Thomas maintained his main cabin fire, ventured outside periodically to clear snow from his door, and retrieve firewood from his cupboard stack. Accumulation reached 3 feet, then 4 feet, then 5 feet. The wind created drifts that towered above his cabin's roofline. On the 3rd day, he could no longer open his main door against the weight of snow pressed against it. The drift had buried the entrance completely, under an estimated 7 feet of packed snow. Thomas was not alarmed. He had anticipated exactly this scenario. He secured his main cabin, banked the fire to conserve wood, gathered essential items, and retreated into his hidden room. He closed and latched the concealed door, sealing himself into the earth-sheltered chamber. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault. Inside the hidden room, Thomas was warm and safe. He established a routine: wake with first light filtering dimly through cracks around the door, build up the fire from overnight coals, eat a breakfast of dried meat and cornmeal mush cooked over the small hearth, tend the fire throughout the day, adding logs as needed, read from his Bible by candlelight, sleep on folded blankets near the hearth. The days blurred together, marked only by his methodical consumption of supplies and firewood. On the 5th day, he heard sounds from the main cabin. Loud cracking noises, groaning timbers, then a tremendous crash that shook dust from the hidden room ceiling. Part of his main cabin's roof had collapsed under the accumulated snow weight. Thomas listened carefully, but heard no further structural failure. He remained in the hidden room. There was nothing he could do about roof damage during an active blizzard, and attempting to assess or repair it would be suicide. The storm finally diminished on the 8th day. By the 9th day, skies cleared. Thomas had been sealed in his hidden room for 6 days. He had used approximately 100 logs from his stored supply, leaving him with wood for several more weeks if necessary. His food stocks remained adequate. His water barrel was half full. He felt physically comfortable, mentally sound, and completely secure. He opened the concealed door and stepped into his main cabin. Cold air hit him immediately. Snow had pushed through the collapsed section of roof, covering nearly half the interior floor. The main fireplace sat buried under snow and broken timbers. If Thomas had been dependent solely on his main cabin during this storm, he would have frozen to death by the 4th or 5th day. Instead, he was alive, healthy, and warm. His hidden winter room had transformed a lethal situation into a manageable inconvenience. The innovation had proven itself under the exact conditions he had designed it to survive. Word of Thomas Garrett's survival spread through the scattered trapping community during the spring of 1844. Other trappers had assumed he was dead. His cabin location placed him directly in the path of the February storm's worst fury. When a trapper named Harrison traveled through the area in late March and found Thomas alive, repairing his damaged roof, Harrison thought he was seeing a ghost. Thomas explained what had kept him alive. Harrison asked to see the hidden room. Thomas showed him. Harrison was not a man given to easy amazement, but he stood inside that earthen chamber, examining the shelving, the secondary hearth, the concealed entrance, and said it was the most intelligent piece of frontier engineering he had witnessed in 20 years of mountain life. He asked detailed questions about excavation, ventilation, heating efficiency, and construction time. Thomas answered everything honestly. Harrison left and told every trapper he encountered about Garrett's winter room. By the following autumn, 3 other trappers had built similar structures. Each adapted the concept to their specific locations. One man excavated beneath his cabin floor, creating a drop-down chamber accessed through a trapdoor. Another built into a ravine behind his cabin, using the natural earth formation as his walls. A third created a false back wall in his cabin that concealed a room carved into a hillside. The specific techniques varied, but the principle remained constant. A secondary earth-sheltered space with independent heating provided survival insurance when primary shelter failed. The winter of 1845 brought another severe storm, though not as catastrophic as the previous year's blizzard. 2 trappers survived that storm in their hidden rooms after their main cabin doors became blocked by snow. Both credited Thomas's innovation with saving their lives. The concept continued spreading. By 1847, an estimated dozen trappers across the Wind River and Absaroka ranges had built backup winter rooms into their cabin systems. The technique acquired various names. Some called them Garrett rooms after Thomas. Others used terms like winter holes, earth chambers, or backup rooms. The specific name mattered less than the principle. Experienced mountain men began accepting that a well-built cabin needed redundancy, not just adequacy. Young trappers entering the mountains heard advice from veterans about building hidden winter rooms before their first serious storm arrived. Thomas left the mountains in 1849, following thousands of others drawn to California goldfields. He never found significant gold, but established a small ranch in the Sacramento Valley where he raised cattle and lived quietly. He married in 1852, fathered 4 children, and died in 1876 at age 65. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned he had been a mountain man in his youth. It said nothing about hidden rooms or survival innovations. But in the Rocky Mountains, trappers and later homesteaders continued building earth-sheltered backup chambers into their cabins through the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Some structures survived into the 20th century, discovered by hunters or archaeologists who found the concealed doorways and wondered about the men who had engineered survival into hillsides. The builders' names were mostly forgotten. The principle they had learned from Thomas Garrett remained. When winter becomes lethal, redundancy means survival. 1 room might fail, but 2 rooms, one hidden in the earth, could withstand anything the mountains offered.